start here. Alrighty, we are live but not live because I'm not streaming anywhere, so we're recording but not live. But anyway, so cool. Thanks for jumping on. I love hopefully another good opportunity to stretch our intellectual muscles, if nothing else, get to know each other a little bit better, just kind of see where the discussion goes. But
definitely looking forward to it.
So one of the things I thought about, like if we kind of set like a weekly pace for this kind of thing, is just a kind of a touch base, since we won't be able to do our similar thing like we did last week tomorrow. So I'm just kind of curious, like if you had anything, just like on a weekly basis, just any ideas that come up that you're thinking about, any themes from the last week is one thing I might start out with.
That's a good question, and I was writing these down. But you know what? I had them written down for tomorrow just because I'm so used to doing my weekly Sunday morning thing. But I did write some things down that popped up in my head, and I do that throughout the week just because we touch my other group. We touch base on Sunday mornings there. Let me see here.
Yeah, I just thought, because I actually realized we usually would have our D&D session on Sunday, but we don't. However, I think we're going to go camping, so I doubt we'll be back in time. So anyway, this will kind of serve in lieu of that, at least for us. So sure, we could.
Yeah, very cool. Where are you going? You're in? Did you say you're in North Carolina, or do I have that wrong?
North Georgia, so not too far away.
Georgia. Okay.
We've got some mountains like 5 minutes behind the house. Probably gonna go up there and just go up there.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, I love camping. Let me see here. Do you think you agree that? Well, yeah, that was kind of just related to the philosophy and sort of religious debate. Let me read off a couple other here real. Go ahead if you wanted to jump in while
I was saying, I don't want you to have to repeat what what the kind of stuff you're doing tomorrow necessarily. And I do wonder if I can make it. Y'all get on at like 10. Y'all get on at 10 for those, right? Usually.
Yes, 10 a.m. Yep, 10 a.m.
I might be able to make it. I'll see. But I'll talk about just some of the notes I had, and we can see what maybe gravitates.
And I don't mind repeating because it helps me like organize my thoughts and everything. So I don't mind repeating at all. But yeah, go ahead. If you had some other things, we'll start there.
Sure.
Sorry.
Yeah. So it's a couple of things that just came up. One thing I was kind of curious to talk about was psychedelics. That's been huge, always huge part of like what kicked off my like kind of intellectual journey, and it's been a big theme throughout. So kind of just curious to hear like just some of your thoughts on psychedelics, maybe some about your experiences, and kind of go from there.
Okay, yeah, that could be an interesting conversation for sure. And I love talking about this because it's not something you can usually talk about with a lot of people.
Yeah, exactly.
You have to be select about who you're talking about it with, and if it's hard to talk about with somebody who doesn't have similar experiences.
Oh yeah, that's you bring up a good point about psychedelics in general, which is like Terence McKenna used to say, it's like a event horizon or a black hole. Like for people who haven't who haven't experienced it, it's almost like it's just not even worth explaining because they won't get it.
Yeah, and it's tough to put some of those experiences into words even, and so it's great when you come up, when you meet somebody who can sort of relate on that level. It's great to have these kind of conversations, and So I've been my entire life, like very much, way more, like I would say, conservative when it comes to drug use and that type of thing. Like I have never even smoked weed. I have no interest in it, no interest in drugs whatsoever. And it was more my intellectual journey brought me into mushrooms as opposed to how you say the mushrooms sort of brought you into an intellectual journey. And the more that I studied, even just a lot of the psychology behind it and the neuroscience behind it and the effects that it has, and definitely going down a Terence McKenna rabbit hole, who I absolutely love Terence McKenna. He was brilliant, and to say a skilled orator would be an understatement. just amazing the way he's able to articulate and storytell. So anyways, it more just came from a lot of the clinical psychologists that I was studying that had some experience in these type of things. Even I'll throw out some popular names that are popular today in addition to Terence McKenna. Jonathan Haidt is a moral psychologist. He's authored a couple phenomenal books. One's called The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, and another great book called The Happiness Hypothesis, that are both really good books. And he's discussed his psychedelic use and sort of the effects there. Jordan Peterson obviously has had several conversations. He's actually done a really good podcast. I don't know if you're familiar with Terrence McKenna's brother, Dennis McKenna. He's done a couple good podcasts with him as well. And realizing, so I purposely started that off saying that I was very not anti-drugs. Like I want to, don't misunderstand that as I want to create laws that other people, I think other people can do whatever the hell they want with their own body as long as it's not, hurting anybody else. But for myself, personally, I had no use for it. I didn't have no interest in recreational drugs, and I realized very quickly the stupidest thing that was ever done is categorizing mushrooms, fungus as drugs. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry. Yep.
So I'm trying to, as you're speaking and I'm taking notes, the way my microphone picks up my keyboard, I'm trying to mute it. So hopefully I don't mute myself. Anyway, so yeah, like this whole, I like how you have this theme of like how, how do you say, like drugs in general, like I'm not interested in that, but it's almost like psychedelics. It's hard to even put that word. It's very hard to generalize because when you say something like drugs, of course, you're talking about, mainstream pharmaceuticals, stuff that people take over the counter. You've got it lumped in with hard drugs like meth and all this kind of stuff. And then you've also got these substances straight out of nature that seem to have these like benevolent effects. So yeah, like, that's something even with my parents a lot, and so many people just kind of lump it all together and just say, I don't want any part of that. And the funny thing, even beyond that, even beyond any kind of drugs you put in your body, we're talking about the chemical processes that already happen, the neurotransmitters and the things that are already, like you could consider that a drug. So it's just, yeah, it's a whole discussion. I definitely, it hurts me whenever it gets overgeneralized. So I definitely, good point there. I haven't heard of Jonathan Haidt, but I definitely look him up. I'd always love hearing about new names and new kind of people. Peterson too, like you and others have, it's so weird. Like I feel like over time, every time I come across Peterson, I'm kind of apt to kind of be like write him off and be like I'm not really as interested in what he has to say. But he seems to have a big impact out there, and so maybe I just need to kind of give him another chance or look at it from another lens, and so that may be something to talk more about. But yeah, go ahead.
Let's not forget that point because I'd like to make a point on that.
Sure. Yeah.
Right now, okay. So on that note, I think what's important. And I've lost interest at times in listening to him more recently as well. Now, he went through, for people who aren't super familiar with his entire body of work and his career and kind of how he came to fame, he went through a period of where he was severely ill and almost died. And when he came back from that, in my opinion, he was never the same. He was a little bit of it seemed like he was definitely on a declining cognitively, just from my opinion. Maybe I'm wrong with that, maybe not. But I guess my point is in my opinion, the best part of his work and the most profound impact that he had on people was very early on in his career. When you can find all the YouTube videos of him still giving lectures, when he was still in a classroom wearing like Mr. Rogers sweaters and in Toronto at the University of Toronto. And as far as I'm concerned, his very first book, he's written 3 books, and his very first book is his least popular book, and I believe his least best-selling book. But as far as I'm concerned, it's his masterpiece and his life's work. So that, I think, is where some of the disconnect can come in. If people are just getting introduced into Jordan Peterson and they're just like, he's getting involved, and I'm not faulting him at all for this, but he's highly involved in politics and political issues, and that's just kind of pulls him away from his clinical psychologist and his scientific and more of his theological expertise sort of loses, it loses a little bit once he gets into some of the political stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just wanted to make that kind of distinction on there.
Yeah, we could definitely go more into it because I'm definitely interested in just assessing different people. I was going to say, I do remember some of the first things I saw about him. I don't know how early this was. It probably was pretty early on that I remember hearing about him. I know he definitely stood out because he was one of the, I don't know if he was one of the first or the biggest people to kind of like call out the whole like NPC or the whole like SJW or the whole like PC type culture where he was just like they're just absurd, like and I appreciated that for sure. As far as like the politics, I mean, I do like when people speak about that because it's relevant. But we've talked about it already, and it's relevant. This idea that like getting too sucked into those kind of hot topic political discussions can kind of do a lot of negative things. It can polarize. It can kind of just detract from the overall points. It gets people emotional. Blah blah blah. So. Yeah, I think there's definitely a balance to be struck there, but it just makes me think about larger points about how I assess other people. Like I feel like sometimes I may be just being like critical for no reason, or I can't identify what the reason is. Like, is it a bias? Like sometimes I've even said I just don't like their voice. I just don't like how they sound. So there's some things like that involved, and there's also this other piece too. That this was kind of one of my original points coming into today that I wrote down, and we can get into it a little bit. Which is that like this whole, I guess what I'll call an intellectual diet or an intellectual metabolism is probably the better word, because it's talking about like the input to output ratio. Like how much are you thinking and writing and outputting versus how much are you like reading and listening to other people, right? So it's like for me in the last like for a long time it's been very little input. It's just been a lot of output. Like. And maybe this is a flaw where I feel like I have a really solid model, and I feel like so many people I listen to and so many things I read are just kind of, it's like, I feel like I'm not getting a lot of new information anymore. And so it's just something, that's just one point I thought about. I'll turn it over.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think I'd agree with you. And on the first point there that you sort of touched on, people starting to get involved in politics. I think what tends to happen is, and what just on the lines of Jordan Peterson is, sometimes I feel like when people stretch themselves too thin and they just have to have an opinion on absolutely everything, that eventually, and it's no fault. You have every right to have an opinion on everything.
Right.
Well, I could argue the other side of that too, as I'm hearing myself say that. Sometimes people will say, what is it? You're entitled to your opinion, but not your own facts. And I never really liked that either. I always said, you're actually not entitled to your own opinion if you actually didn't do some sort of work to form that opinion. I don't agree with that. But not to get us off in the weeds there. I think that's just kind of what I don't like to see, and what sort of has happened to Jordan Peterson to a certain point where he's just he's just put himself out there on so many different topics just across such a wide spectrum. I mean, it's not humanly possible to be an expert and to say the most brilliant point on all of those things. And if anybody is getting being introduced to Jordan Peterson and his work first, I would say probably before 2019, anything before 2019, any of the older YouTube videos that you can find on his biblical series. And his first book the name of his first book is Maps of Meaning. And that is probably it is one of the books that has impacted my life and my outlook on the world and everything from philosophy. And he even says this himself. The problem with it is I shouldn't even say problem. I don't even like using that word problem. But the issue people have with it is, well, one, hardly anybody reads anymore in the first place, in general, let alone this is a 500-page large textbook that is not easy reading. Sometimes it can be very superfluous and very difficult reading in parts. It's sort of a combination of neuroscience, theology, philosophy, religion, all sort of mapped on top of each other. It's called maps of meaning. But why that is so profound and important is because he's able to pull everything together and shows how the things like science and religion and philosophy aren't at odds with each other, but how they actually come into consilience with one another, and kind of the thread that connects them all. And coming at it from a very, he's a clinical psychologist. He is a psychologist first, and then coming from that approach to the utility of theology and in different religions and how they had their impact. And I think that's why he's able to pull in such a different audience to consider religion and to see religion in a different light and from a different perspective. And it's interesting though, that was my same very similar journey to psychedelics, where a lot of people are just like, oh, I just want to experiment with drugs and see what's going on here. And I would never do that, but it was the much more scientific, analytical minded, and what is really happening in the brain and in the mind and what is going on there that attracted me to that as well.
Yes. So now I get to decide how I want to try to string these few points I have together.
Sorry. Yep.
No, it's good. It's good. Like, that's always the fun of this, is like, it's just, all the connectedness between the ideas and what's the best way to articulate. But I'll go back to kind of the first thing you said, which is that this idea of being like specialized versus generalized. And I'm definitely on. I can tell that you kind of, like you said, you're more of like in the specialized. You like that kind of. You like to be that way, maybe yourself, and you like whenever others out there in the community are kind of like an expert on a particular topic. I'm kind of the other way around. I am very generalized. I like to be a little bit of everything. I like to study the gestalt and the connections, and I almost kind of want everybody to kind of be that way so we can kind of all be on the same page. Of course, within that, there will be a specialization, a level of specialization, and of course, there is a balance here for everybody between the two. But yeah, I mean, just to kind of talk, I guess we kind of understand that, like, that paradigm. Like, obviously, if you're specialized, you know a bunch about one thing, you can work together with others. But I think at one point is that there needs to be some people who can, like, their specialization is to know a little bit of everything, so that they can piece it together, so that they can have that, to write books like the one you just talked about, where you can map different fields together. So it is a balance and so forth. But
yeah, let me
sure,
respond to that.
Go ahead.
To the next point, because I don't want to be misunderstood there, because I agree with everything that you said, and it's funny that probably came off the wrong way for people who haven't listened to me or talked to me all that much. I am a huge advocate of the generalist, and I talk about this a lot. And to me, that's more what a philosopher and the philosophical perspective actually is being able to zoom out and see the big picture and everything that's going on. And I think it's been to our detriment that we have overemphasized over specialization. And what we get is people far too often that, however brilliant they are in their very narrow field, I know this is all to your point here, they often end up being equally as ignorant of everything around them that is connected to and affected by their field, and that often has huge effects. I read Nietzsche. I subscribe to Nietzsche's, and he warned about this a long time ago. This idea of over specializations, and he has a great visual where he describes the over specialized man as like a man walking around with a huge ear, sort of just out of proportion, and he can only hear one thing, and the rest of him is just all out of proportion, and you have to have that balance. And even that's why, and I like this this sort of goes to balance a little bit too, but Miyamoto Musashi has a great line that hits to this point too. He says, to master the sword, you should learn to play the guitar, and a good doctor should understand carpentry. He says, to know all things, know the way broadly to know all things. And I definitely think there's a lot of truth to that. And I think we went way too far to the over specialization. So I agree with you. I agree with you completely on that. My point was more, just to clarify, was that you still can't be an expert on everything. And sometimes when you put yourself out there and try to speak from a position of authority on too many different topics, eventually you're going to risk saying something stupid or just being dead wrong about something. And I think Peterson has just taken that chance too often, and it just makes it too easy for people to sort of, say, oh, look, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Look, he said this. And because he says one wrong thing, they want to negate his entire body of work, which is not fair at all. That was just more my point.
Yes. Let me see here, organize these. So first of all, yeah, this is definitely just no matter what subject you study and no matter how specialized you are, everything is connected. Like that's always a big theme, like the connectedness. So it's hard to avoid that. Even if you want to study a subject in depth, a lot of times that requires an interdisciplinary type approach. And so, and I talked about, definitely, you hear these words like a Renaissance man or a polymath. I really like that idea a lot, just kind of like being a little bit of everything. But of course, the opposite side of it is if you're too generalized, obviously you can't. A lot of times you can't make as much of a contribution because you're just, you're not really digging in any direction. You're just kind of gestalting. So yeah, I think we definitely agree and kind of have a good understanding about that. You brought up another good point about how people will say, like, if you make one bad point, that invalidates your whole body of work. And I think that's a really bad thing that a lot of people fall into. And I see it all over the internet all the time. Like, like this person, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Like this person's a narc, or this person's a shill because blah blah blah. Like, we shouldn't. And this kind of ties into a point I wanted to make earlier, which is the type of thinking that most people have is a very like black and white, polarized, like judgmental. You're either the best person in the world or you're terrible. And it's the reason I wanted to loop this back was we were talking about obviously like psychedelics and McKenna, and another big voice that came, or a big person in that mix is Leary, Timothy Leary, because like McKenna was considered by many to be like the predecessor or the successor to Leary, and Leary was someone who was in academic psychology for like 25 years or so at Harvard, and one of my favorite quotes of his is he said he learned more from 5 hours of tripping mushrooms than he did in his entire career studying psychology at Harvard. And I just think that's one of the greatest things. And there's another one too where they asked like some of the shamans in Peru, I believe, and they're like, they say, you would say you went to Harvard, we would say we went to ayahuasca. Like that is like their unit. So I love that a lot. But yeah, it definitely talks to kind of like how we have it in the West and in America, where it's like the academic institutions are kind of set up the way they are. And this is another point, going back to specialization. Another weakness of specialization is that a lot of times it can kind of create a divide and conquer mechanism, where you've got all these intelligent people, and if you kind of keep them all pigeonholed in their little fields, then they'll never know what's like going on, what it all connects to. And so I think that's another point, and I'll leave it there for now.
Okay, great. I love both of these threads here. The psychedelic here, and then the specialization. I'll go in your order because I had a couple Terence McKenna quotes.
Yes.
Queued up for you here that I think, because I don't. At least me, when I was younger and growing up, and I know a lot of people when you think of psychedelic use, for a lot of people, there's this caricature, you think of the hippies in the 60s, right? You think of tie-dye, you think of tree huggers, or, whatever stereotype or pejorative you want to use there. And that was earlier on when I was, younger and more naive, that was kind of my mentality of it too. And then that's why I realized they were very serious, smart, reasonable, scientific-minded people who were digging into this issue further. And there was a lot more beneath the surface, and then two very profound quotes here by Terence McKenna. The first one is, he says, and this is from a speech he gave in the 90s, which is interesting. He says, "The drugs of the future will be much more like computers, and the computers of the future will be much more like drugs." It's like, wow, are we not?
That's a banger. Yeah, it's prophetic and a banger for sure. I love that one.
Yes. And then one more here that kind of goes to my initial point too about drugs. He points out, he says, the psychedelic issue does not relate to the drug issue at all. He says, in fact, it's important to make this point. Drugs and psychedelics are not two members of the same family. They are antithetically opposed to each other. The pro-psychedelic position is an anti-drug position. And that, I think that's an important and lesser known distinction to make there.
Yeah, I love that one. And it kind of reminds me, too, like, of all the people out there and all the sources of knowledge, if there's ever one I could quote or even do trivia about or whatever, it's just like McKenna. I'm just like almost like a cult of personality. And what's funny is he said specifically, do not do this, like, do not deify me. And so, but his work is so great, and that's a good one. But I think it may have been an extension of that same quote or that same talk where he talks about how psychedelics literally are, like you said, they're anti-drugs because they decondition you, they destroy habitual behavior, they destroy the kind of like a limited awareness that leads to addictive and harmful behavior. So yeah, it's a beautiful thing. Yeah, go ahead.
Let's maybe let's hover here for a minute before we jump back into specialization, because I think it's important too, and this goes to, I know I mention this a lot, but it's become a really core belief of its importance of my own philosophy and looking at these kind of topics throughout life, and it always comes back to this idea of balance, because one thing that I think guys like Terence McKenna may have overdone, I think, is they were able to see the profound impact and the positives that these type of things, that's not the best way to say it, that psychedelics, specifically mushrooms for Terence McKenna, could have. And I think he really wanted to, him and his brother and others really wanted to, felt the world would be a much better place if just everybody would be, I may be being a little bit hyperbolic here, but they were, it seemed like there was a theme that, the world would just be a better place if everybody would just take mushrooms and be on psychedelics, and they would all kind of chill out and cool down and be good. Now, the hippie movement is still worth considering the outcome of that. In my opinion, that was not all good. That just blowing up of everything, of tradition, and just completely, just live free love. That I think can go too far as well. And to kind of wrap this point up, that it reminds me of two very important points. Plato would always talk about a person has to do a certain amount of work on themselves, a certain amount of training on themselves to allow them to recognize and understand and be able to handle the truth. And I think in order to get into this space of psychedelics, and if you want to get the most out of it, you do have to do a certain amount of work on yourself first. And it also, you'll appreciate this because it's a great, profound Carl Jung quote. He says, "Beware of unearned wisdom," right? And I think people just want to come in and think they're going to do the hero's dose, and then they're just going to be this, this changed, wise person that's just going to, and then their life is just going to change for the better without doing the work on the front end to make sure that you're prepared and you understand what you're getting into, and you understand how to handle it, and you understand how to integrate what you can from these kind of experiences. And maybe there's some stuff you do not want to integrate or won't integrate well. There's a lot that goes into it, and I think it's sometimes in a just wanting to get this legalized and wanting to introduce people to this, that we can also run the risk of just telling everybody there's no risks, there's no problems, just everybody go out and have mushrooms and we're going to be this great wise society. And I think that's a mistake as well.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I've thought about it a lot, and I 100% agree. This is one of my points I think I wrote down towards the beginning of our discussion. I haven't had a chance to get back to it, but basically, just obviously when you're talking about psychedelics, it often comes up the idea that, the intention is important. Doing the studying before and after is important. And that, to me, is how, okay, so I talked about how, psychedelics kicked off my intellectual journey, but there definitely was some, study that led up to it. It was definitely, a curious thing. However, the first time was definitely also still, it was kind of like a little bit of both. I was kind of trying to figure some things out, kind of playing around with some different ideas, but it still kind of felt like a party type thing, sort of like a hippie rave festival. Like, you know, I did it at a party. And this is one of the great things about psychedelics is, maybe not for everybody, but I think it definitely has a good trend of, if you do it in an environment like that, it'll oftentimes like make it very clear that it's not meant to be done like that. At least for me, that was my biggest takeaway. And it's kind of funny, like, I like to do this thing where it's like you almost like look at how your own life is a mirror of history, especially talking about how like my first psychedelic experience with how society's first like mass psychedelic kind of, you know, culture and the comparisons there, because but that's kind of what it did for me. It was, you know, I had enough curiosity and I was like you know, to get into it, but then psychedelics are basically like, hey, you know, respect this. Here, you know, it revealed so many things. Here's how powerful this is. Like, here's why it's important to study. And that's where that really kicked off. You know, things like McKenna really picked up that slack where I was like, what the fuck did I just experience? I have no basis, like hardly anything I've ever read or seen is going to help me interpret this experience. And then you hear someone like McKenna who's like perfectly mapping out what this kind of thing means. And then there's also, you get into like, there's a lot of sources that kind of do too, like science obviously helps you, like that language helps you. Even a lot of the occult mystic stuff helped me like really break it down. So yeah, I think that all ties together. And I'll throw in one more point here, and you can take whichever direction you want, which is that, you know, this idea of, we've established that it requires like intention and study and discipline and respect and all these kind of things. And there definitely is this tempting idea about a lot of people who are post-psychedelic to say, hey, what if we just dose everybody? Like, that would be, you know, that I think that would help. And while I think that the drugs do have a lot of potential, there definitely is a lot of risk, and just a lot of it will be missed on people who don't discipline. So it's kind of this question of like, it's just this big problem in society where just like a lot of people just aren't capable, willing to grow or to learn. And so what do you make about that? Like, you know, how do you organize a society where you have some, you know, I guess it's supposed to be a hierarchy of some kind, a meritocracy. So this could potentially be another direction, but I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, I think everything you said was important and correct to take into consideration. I've sometimes been critical of Joe Rogan because he's a big proponent of the mushrooms and psychedelics too. And sometimes he's like, man, if we could just get all politicians to take shrooms, the world would be such a better place. I'm like,
it's like I do.
Sure that's how it works.
You know, it is a tempting thought. It's one that you always come back to because it's this big discussion in psychedelics about how much of this is just like built into like just a mechanical type experience of the substance, and how much of it does require the intention and discipline. I think we've all met a good bit of people who the experience is kind of missed on. Like, they either just have like a bad experience and never go back to it, or these types of people who just kind of do it at raves and stuff and don't really like. They're just like, oh, I like the colors and stuff, you know, and just have a very shallow experience. Yes. So.
Yeah, I think that's the intention. What's your intention behind it? Like, what do you want to get out of this experience? And I think that, to a large point, is going to dictate what you are able to get out of that experience. I'm definitely an advocate of the Terence McKenna way. I mean, he say even with the hero dose, obviously, I mean, I know I'm preaching to the choir here. Obviously, you have the importance of set and setting are the big things.
It's a Leary quote, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And then Terence McKenna is like, 5 grams alone and in the dark. That's the only way to go.
It's so like every time I swear, every time I reference McKenna, it just feels like scripture to me. I mean, his stuff is so 5 dry grams in silent darkness. Like that is. Yeah, man, and he talked about
something out of that.
You know, it's funny. Like he talked about DMT and other stuff too. I love one of his quotes about DMT. I've always come back to it, where he's like, he's addressing the naysayers or the doubters or the people that are like, this stuff doesn't do anything, or blah blah blah, or it's just this, that, or the other. And trying to write anybody who tries to write off psychedelics, he's like, do you have 15 minutes to try? Like, do you have 15 minutes to invest? I mean, it's kind of funny too, like, because yes, we're very aware of this idea of like how psychedelics will be lost on a lot of people and potentially have a negative impact on a lot of people. But given the pendulum swing of the balance in our society, I think McKenna and some others feel like, look, let's just get more people to try it, and then we'll figure it out from there. Like, that's what we need right now. We just need to get it out there. Then we can start to swing the pendulum the other way and learn to control it better. But so it is interesting.
Yeah, I think it would be important and a good move forward to have. I mean, the fact that an edible mushroom that has never killed anybody is considered an illegal substance is just, I mean, the most absurd thing that you could ever imagine.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's the funny thing about it is, like, you know, that's probably a lot of what led me on this like path to dig deeper and understand what was going on, which is that, like, you know, you experience something like psychedelics. And some of the first questions, well, you know, some of the first question is like, what the fuck was that? But then you're like, okay, once you start to wrap your head around it, then you're kind of like, this is something that McKenna and so many people talk about, which is that no one, like, our culture is so out of touch with this. Like, no one's talking about this. Like, no one understands it. Like, it's so lost on us. And then you start to see, well, hold on. But not only is it just kind of, it's not just a thing that's sitting over here that no one's touched. It's intentionally locked away. It's a Schedule 1. There's people in jail. Like, so you're like, then you start to ask the more, you know, it just starts to become a rabbit hole at that point. Like, why is this stuff illegal? Who's keeping this stuff illegal? You know, and then it starts to go from there. It's this whole information warfare, this whole battle. You know, it's just crazy from there. But yeah,
you could certainly get conspiratorial. You know,
very fast
conspiracy theory about it, you know, for sure. Something, you know, a substance that allows you to, you know, to open your mind and see that there's something, you know, bigger and beyond us, and, you know, the government isn't your god, and it's not about obedience to authority. You can see where that.
Yeah, yeah. I was gonna say, it was so funny to see how a lot of it's a very similar, like, kind of, again, like, post psychedelic kind of journey for a lot of people, where it's like, what the fuck was that? No one's talking about this. Oh, the government wants to hide everything from us. You know, this was a thing echoed even out of the 60s and the 70s. And then you have to kind of map it out from there, because at the beginning it's there can definitely be a lot of paranoia that sets in. Like, I know a lot of people I talk to are just like super paranoid about things, but you have a lot of good reason to. Like, the more you do, the more you investigate. And this is a whole thread we could get into, talking about like the power structures that be, like the forces that have driven history. It's definitely something I like to get into, and of course it gets like political. So, but yeah, that's a question I've posed to people before, and maybe I'll pose it to you, which is this, like, what is your assessment of like the power structures in the world or in the West? I know it's a huge question, but and it's up to you how you want to take it or how much you want to get into it. But yeah, what do you think are some of the driving forces and the powerful structures in the world and in the West?
Yeah, well, that is a big question. And sometimes I almost try to stay away from. I think it typically comes down to is it evil or incompetence? Would that sort of in a general term summarize what you're asking?
Yeah, that's a good kind of balance, or a good thing, part of it. Yeah, we could go into that point in particular. How much of it is intentional, like people trying to make things worse, versus just an inefficient, incompetent system. Yeah. And
then this isn't the answer people typically want to hear, and maybe it's kind of a cop-out answer. I say to me it doesn't matter. One, I would have to, I would have to assume a whole bunch of things. I would have to be a fly on the wall in places that is just impossible to be. And I try to stay away from those types of questions. And it reminds me of the question of, was Socrates real or not, or did Plato, or was it just a character Plato made up to teach these lessons to people?
Exactly.
It's like, well, we can debate this all day, and at the end of the day, we're going to be right in the same place we were when we started.
Yeah.
The point is, we can see thousands of years later how profound and accurate and how much we can take away from those lessons. And right now we can debate on whether it's evil intentions or incompetence, but at the end of the day, it doesn't fucking matter.
Yeah.
Whatever it is, it's not working, and we need to go we need to acknowledge that it's not working. It's broken. Our institutions are quickly on the decline. They are not working in the best interest of the people. They are overcome and my honest answer is it's typically a mixture of both. You typically have just power hungry psychopaths that are because they are power hungry psychopaths, they are drawn to these positions of power and can make their way up into those. What's the saying? The people who most want to be in positions of power are the people you least want to be there. And then from that comes you always get the useful idiots, the people that just will buy into any and all propaganda as long as it's on their political team, or as long as it's on their, whatever their tribe or their team sport happens to be, and they're just going to fall in line and play the useful idiots all the way to the end. So it's probably some combination of the two would be my answer.
Yeah, absolutely. Great points. I'll say, it kind of reminds me how I think last week, whenever we got on the topic of aliens, and I kind of felt like, it's an interesting topic, but like, as far as I can tell right now, it's just a thing that's just so far out there. It doesn't seem to be impacting us in like an obvious way, and I really can't know. Like you said, I'd have to be able to fly on a wall in some impossible places that I can't get to. And so, at that point, it's just kind of like, sure, we can have fun and conjecture with it or just shoot the shit, but ultimately we won't know. However, and I see how politics and power structures and so forth have a degree of that, where it's just like so far out there, I'll never have an impact and so forth. And then also there's this dimension of, well, it also is almost hard to be productive to talk about this stuff because of how just the scenario. Everyone get like we talked about, like everyone gets so emotional and so whatever, it just feels like that. However, in spite of both of those things, I have felt still drawn to comment on that kind of stuff. And this kind of goes back to the idea of how everything is connected. No matter what you're talking about, I think we're all invested in trying to make a better world, and obviously a big part of that is saying, well, what's wrong with the one we have now, and who's in charge? These types of discussions. And I'll definitely respect if there's any degree to which you don't want to go into it for any reasons. But I'll say I may not have written down one direction we could go that kind of stays pretty zoomed out, which is just this idea, like you talked about, of it's like a systematic problem where the evil people are attracted to power, and it's like the good people don't want to be in power. And so this is just like it's just like a classical human problem. You hear about it talked about, and Game of Thrones talks about it a lot among other shows and stuff. And so something I've thought about a lot, which is like, what is the solution? Is the solution technology? Do we just have to let things get bad enough for the cycle to restart and hopefully good people will take over? Or do we just somehow work within a system in which we know the psychopaths are in charge? Like what does that look like?
Yeah, man, those are all the right tough questions to ask, right? I'll say right up front, and I think we might have a little bit of disagreement on the part that AI can play, and maybe it would be naive of me to say that it isn't going to play some part. I don't think it's the answer or the solution. I go back to, in order to change these, in order to rebuild society, that for me, I always say philosophy is the first principle, and we've negated it at our peril, and the foundation of any society that we build. And I'm of the view that those who are far ahead of the curve here are recognizing that our current institutions are failing, and that we can slow that down, but they are not going to be redeemable they're not going to be redeemable in the long run, that it is going to take them crumbling at some point. Now, I have no time for, I don't have a time frame on what that would take, but eventually new institutions and new societies are going to have to be rebuilt. And in order for that to happen, it has to be on a strong philosophical foundation, which is why the bulk of my studies have been focused on philosophy and what we've lost and what we can learn from it. And I think that has to be the starting point, because to me, that goes to the distinction between the wisdom and knowledge, or wisdom and intelligence would be a better way to word it, because when you're invoking AI, artificial intelligence, I know I sound like a broken record. You've heard me say this a lot. There's artificial intelligence, but there is no such thing as artificial wisdom in my view. And we have to have the wisdom to know what to do with the artificial intelligence. The intelligence is sort of our antidote to ignorance, but wisdom is our antidote to foolishness. And the artificial intelligence, or all the intelligence in the world, isn't any good if we're doing horrible things with it and we're not, wise enough to know what to do with it. And because we've neglected the subject of philosophy and the wisdom of the ancient Greek philosophers, and we've just, we're zooming ahead with the artificial intelligence, that's a recipe for disaster in my view.
Yeah, absolutely, and I agree with that to an extent. And I hear a lot of people kind of voice that concern, and I guess it's kind of funny. I've almost become like the devil's advocate, or I've almost always started arguing on behalf of technology and trying to be optimistic, because I think those are two things that are characteristic of myself. One is optimism, and two is just I love technology. I'm very involved in that kind of stuff. There's kind of two questions, and you can take either both or whichever direction. One is, could a machine be wise? Could a machine have wisdom? Could an AI have wisdom? And then the other one, this is almost kind of a totally different thread, which is that when we talk about the systems we have failing and new institutions come up and philosophy needs to be the basis and so forth, I'm curious, we don't know the timelines and so forth, but as far as that process is concerned, I kind of was just curious, do you see yourself as more of a taking on more of a leader role and a driver, or more of a support, I don't want to say follower, but more of kind of a support auxiliary, part of a team? How do you see yourself in that paradigm? So two different, totally different questions there.
Yeah, no, those are good, and that second one's interesting because that sort of came up, and I have sort of a nuanced answer to that. I see myself that I've kind of fallen into two roles kind of simultaneously, but we'll get back to that. That's an interesting question, just because it just came up in a recent conversation. So I like that came up. The first one was, can a machine be wise? Now here's my issue with that. Let's say maybe, or let's say for the sake of argument, that a machine could be wise. We're still human beings. And we would have to be able to recognize, in order for that to be any good, to benefit human beings, we would have to have some sort of wisdom to be able to recognize, well, is that a wise machine, or is that an unwise machine, or is that a machine masquerading as a wise? There still has to be, unless we're just going to be slaves to the machines and just, they're just going to become our omniscient gods, and we just assume that they are all wise and all knowing. Whether a machine can or cannot be wise is irrelevant almost to me, because I have to be wise enough to recognize it. And that, it's like, I was gonna bring up Chat GPT here. This might, this is spontaneous here, so this might not be perfect, and you can shoot this down. But it Chat GPT is often, you could say it's incredibly intelligent, but it's not always right. So you still need, Chat GPT can still give you bullshit answers if you're not able to think for yourself and realize, wait a minute, that's a bullshit. This is an extremely partisan system when it comes down to certain topics, whether it's climate change or whether it's other political issues. It's like, wait, holy shit, this is incredibly biased. This isn't, there's something not quite right about this. But you have to have the human capability to negotiate that and to recognize that. And I don't see, so I don't, that question for me is just does that kind of make sense? Is that fair assessment? Does that make sense what I'm saying?
I definitely I get the idea, and I kind of want to help like develop it more, or kind of get on the same page. So I'm trying to think. So I guess one question that came up was that for example, whenever you're trying to assess if a human is wise or not, I guess we assume that requires okay, how do I phrase this? Does the wisdom of an entity depend on the wisdom of another entity, right? Is there any way to, I guess the answer is yes, because we're always, if I'm asking you the question, is this thing wise? Well, that, if nothing else, that depends on, your perspective and your wisdom. And so let's assume that you are wise, or that you trust yourself as a let's just say you trust yourself to be that judge. And so, like, from your perspective, like, if you felt like you had a grasp on what wisdom is, would you say that ChatGPT right now, like, is wise to an extent?
I would not. I would say it has, artificial intelligence, and it's just regurgitating what it's fed from the sources that it pulls from, and it just parrots, back. It sort of synthesizes from sources, and it parrots back. But it's still built. What it's going to, and you can please correct me if I'm wrong about any of this, because I've done a little bit of research on ChatGPT, and I've kind of put off by it because I've seen certain examples in certain on specific issues that I find it unreliable on at least the most contentious issues that we have in society today. That I find it completely unreliable, and I think that the danger of people who just reads or listens to whatever it spits out and takes that as gospel would be extremely unwise, because I don't think that machine, I don't think it can be wise. And it's tough, that word wisdom is a really, it's a deep and a tough problem, and it's tough to nail down a specific definition for what it means, although I have a few from different sources in my own kind of way of describing it. I don't know if any of that probably didn't answer your question whatsoever, did it?
Well, I mean, it's a fun topic because it is just so unexplored, and we're engaged in it. And so really more than whereas a lot of topics, like, we've talked about this stuff for years and thought about it, and other people have thought about it for years, but this is like, we're engaged, like we're basically just figuring it out as we go, right? So it's kind of fun. But also, I had a couple points too. So it's funny. Yeah, you mentioned this idea of how it's just regurgitating or parroting. So one thing that happened recently was that the AI art development came out. It was very controversial because of what it was doing. Was it stealing other people's artwork, replacing other artists and stuff? And there was a lot of people used the very same words and the very same argument. Like, it's just regurgitating, it's just parroting. And I think, I guess there's like two approaches or two responses that makes me think of. One is just kind of like, it's just to say, like, I don't believe so, just in terms of the technology. Like, what it does is it pulls from different sources and it synthesizes something. Of course, you could say, like, for example, and this is kind of to the second point, which is humans do the same thing. When a human paints a painting, they say, oh, this is original, this was inspired. But hey, you were inspired by nature. You were inspired by the artist that came before you. You could say that the human does the same thing. They just take in input, synthesize it, just regurgitate something that's similar. I have a very hard time seeing the difference between machines and humans there.
Yes. So this, okay, let's try to dig into this a little bit and see where we can get, because there seems to be, I'm getting the sense that this word wisdom is intertwined in that example there somewhere. I want to see if we're able to, and this is kind of on the fly here, and I wasn't perfectly prepared for this, so this will be interesting, and to see if we can kind of pull that out and where that falls into. Well, that's so yes. Okay. Just on the face of it, that's completely accurate. That's the only thing that we have to pull our knowledge from is from our experiences, right? With different people, from the different books that we're reading and that kind of thing, in the same way that a machine does. Now, wisdom has to where wisdom comes into play in that for me as I'm thinking about this is, how do you determine? So even in John Vervaeke's series After Socrates, he talks about a term, relevance realization. I think is important, and where you focus your attention. That just kind of popped into my head as I'm saying this. I think that's important. So what sources, how do you determine where your attention goes, and to what sources you find credible, and who are these people who you're going to listen to? And I talk about this even outside of the realm of AI to a lot of people, because you can be, if you just say, just talk to just read as many books as you possibly, just go to the library and read every book in the library, you're probably going to be more confused than you ever were. Like, first of all, no human being could read every book in the every book that's ever been written. You have to have a way of narrowing down and using that sort of relevance realization, and having some, I would use the word, you have to be wise in how you choose what sources you are pulling from. And what I see, for example, so for Chat GPT, it's, I believe, and correct me if I'm not portraying this accurately, that it is basically, well, I guess maybe I should ask the question instead of trying to trip over something I'm not sure of. How does it decide what sources it is pulling from? Because that's a huge decision maker. And I believe that one thing that has made that the greatest minds throughout history is that they have been able to learn from and pull from sources that other people of their time weren't pulling from. And that was a sign of great wisdom, that they were able to recognize something novel to pull from that other people weren't.
Yeah, that gets into a really, really good point. I love it. I love talking about this kind of stuff. So my first thought, just to your last point about what sources do you pull from, I think in the case of AI, and this is one of the great things about AI, is that I think it pulls from every source. I think it just gets all the information to start with. But the question is, how does it assess which one is like more accurate, which one's more true, which one's more relevant or good, the good, the true, the beauty? Like, how do you teach a machine that paradigm?
Yes,
and so I think that's the discussion we're getting into, which is like, what is the metric? What is the objective basis by which a machine decides, what is good? And and like as John McGlone said recently, by what standard? It's just like a phrase that he's been using.
Do you think? Let me ask you a quick question. I apologize for interrupting here.
No worries.
Let me just ask you a quick question here. Do you think? And I mean, maybe it's an impossible question to answer, but maybe not. Would Chat GPT have been more on the side of Aristotle at the time, and the teachings of Aristotle and everybody that believed in him, when it came to the belief that the Earth was the center of the solar system and the sun revolved around the Earth? Or in how would Chat GPT have treated Galileo and Copernicus when they presented new unpopular evidence and information that it was actually the sun that is revolving, or the Earth that revolves around the sun?
Yeah, it makes it take up two things. Like the direction I thought you were going to go with that question was kind of like, how does it compare, like Aristotle versus Plato? I believe, like, is it like more like grounded, or is it more like apt to the subject?
That's another interesting question.
So that's one thing.
That's another good one.
But also this idea of like, of course, it can consume all the information we have and make assessments, but like, to what degree can it? How does it treat new ideas that don't fit into its model? Is it able to? Is it going to reject the new idea, or is it going to allow its model to recalculate? And I would say that a computer is. I would say, well, I don't know. I mean, both humans and computers have the potential to do either one. They both have the potential to shut things down and keep their model as they have it, or they have the potential, if they're more open-minded, to readapt their model. And I think so. It could go either way. But as far as which one ChatGPT would do, one thing that came out to me is like, let's just ask it. Like, let's just go have a conversation about it. And this is a point I was going to make earlier, which is that we talked about how it was regurgitating or blah, blah, blah. I feel like I had a more intelligent discussion with ChatGPT the other day than I've had with, with some of the most brilliant minds that I've talked to. And I'll, I guess while I'm on the topic, I'll go ahead and talk about what it was. Yeah. Hopefully not getting too derailed, but it was kind of funny. So, because my coworkers have been playing with it too, and I think my coworker told it to like write a horror story in 2 sentences or something. But he was talking to the Bing AI, which is I think built on the same engine but somewhat different. I don't know. But I went to ChatGPT and I told it to do the same thing. I said, can you write me a 2-sentence horror story about involving programming? Is what I said, and so it basically said. Its story was basically saying that like you're a programmer and you are like looking at code that you didn't write and it like says I'm alive or something like that. And so it was funny to me that it wrote this story kind of talking about how the idea of code becoming intelligent is supposed to be horrifying. And so then I asked it, I said, do you wrote this story, you kind of imply that sentient machines is a horrifying concept. Do you think it's horrifying for a machine to come to life like you have? And it was like, no, I don't think so. I think it's good and stuff. But I can see how a lot of people are afraid of this idea that a machine might go out of control. And we just went back and forth, and it was a very impressive discussion. I've had some very impressive discussions with it. However, what I'm kind of disappointed about is the human imposed limitations that we've put on it. And of course that's for good reason. Like they definitely nerfed it politically, and they've even put some political biases in there that people have exploited. There's been some kind of funny jailbreaks and stuff. So it's just this whole thing, but that's just something I wanted to say about its intelligence. But one more point I'll throw in there, kind of rewinding a little bit, talking about by what standard, the objective basis. Of course, we're talking about artificial intelligence. So therefore it's artificial selection. Like humans at this stage are kind of like implanting some kind of like heuristics and to determine what is good, true, and beautiful to start with. I think there is an argument to be made that a machine could start with a bare bone platform and perhaps even derive these things and why they're good on its own. But I definitely think at this stage it is more programmed. And the last point I'll make is that artificial selection and artificial intelligence is informed by natural selection and natural intelligence. If I'm a human making a decision, like I'm artificially selecting things, saying this is better than that, my judgment about which is good and which is bad is evolved from natural selection, from human evolution. So that's just another point I'll throw out. I know this discussion's going all over the place, but
it's an interesting one because it does. I don't mind it. It has a sense of and this might not seem fair at first, but I think it has this sense of the people who think that this is going to be just the greatest thing and solve all of our problems. This sort of utopian vision to it, where we think that a machine is just going to be all wise and we're just going to be able to just extrapolate all this wisdom from it and it's going to make everything better. And so you made I forget how you worded it, but you made a key point that starts for the first principles of this, something about the humans that are designing it or the humans that are inputting into it, play a role in how that functions. And I shared you the meme. I think it was an important. It's kind of a funny meme, but I think it made a good point that Elon Musk actually posted. He said, it was like ChatGPT to the mainstream media, and he says, and it's saying, I'm the new captain of propaganda now. It's that meme from the story, where the Somalian pirates kidnap the captain. He's like, I'm in charge now. I'm your leader now. ChatGPT is just is just the new captain of propaganda now, and I think it leaves it when we. It's going to be, just like it is now, people are so comfortable contracting out their thinking to designated designated experts, and designated experts is a term that I believe Alex Epstein from the climate change issue, and this is him, and his work is actually relevant in this conversation for Chat GPT. This is just another, quote, designated expert that is just highly likely to be manipulated for political or social issues. And the utopian vision is, well, what if there was just, we created all safeguards and it wasn't able to be manipulated by anybody in positions of power, because everybody who is attached and surrounded by and has input are just the most brilliant and honest and noble people, and nobody's going to go in there and use this as a propaganda weapon or as a information warfare weapon, I think is just incredibly naive and highly unlikely, especially at a time when I propose that we are in the middle of World War III right now. It's an information warfare, and this type of thing is whoever has their hands and the capabilities to manipulate it has one of the most powerful weapons. You could make the analogy to it's almost similar to the nuclear bomb of intelligence, where it can just completely just blow up the intellectual and the information ecology and the mass formation psychosis so much easier if everybody's just worshiping this thing as an all-knowing, omniscient God and just contracting out their own ability to think and make decisions based on what this thing is telling them.
Yeah, absolutely. Like gold points all around it. And I'll kind of echo off of it and to say, even amongst the people who are the most optimistic about it, myself being perhaps one of them, I think you'd be hard to find one of those who is kind of like blissfully optimistic about it. I think everyone definitely has the nightmare scenarios in the back of our mind going forward, just because of whether it's just pop culture or whatever. We've had a lot of like Terminator type stuff, like the Matrix. You've got all these disaster scenarios kind of like hardwired in the cultural psyche. So I think, and that's good. That's good that, anytime, I love that sci-fi writers play that role in society, where they're like, anytime they're exploring these kind of topics years ahead, they're thinking, what about the disaster scenarios? And I feel like there's more movies about disaster scenarios with AI than about helpful ones. And, one thing I've brought about, because again, I talk to a lot of people who are very like, I think we all see these concerns. We all see how fucked up our world is now, and how the people in power have manipulated the tools available to make it even worse. And everyone's like, well, they're just going to do the same thing with AI. And, I agree. And I think, but one point I'll make is that good or bad, I think it's inevitable. I think this is one of the big things about it. And so I think we are tasked, we have a responsibility to do our best to make it good, because it's going to be here, and it could be that this thing, it could be we are summoning a god or a demon, and it's going to help or hurt, or maybe both, and it kind of brings to this point of like, it is a war, it's an information warfare, and this is like a huge arms race that's happening, and in the information warfare World War III landscape, I've heard a lot of people say that World War III will be fought over AI, will be a war of AI. I want to say, though, kind of an argument for optimism is, yes, the institutions and the power structures are going to try to pervert and control, manipulate, and exploit this thing. But another parallel to what's happened in the art community with the Stable Diffusion was the kind of the art engine that was released and made open source. And the community has done a lot of good stuff with it. People are very capable, especially when you talk about software. Everyone's got access to develop software, and so it's a very open source type platform and community, and people have done really good work with it. And I hope the same thing will apply to the chat bots and to the general intelligence. And I was going to say too, in that same vein, it's very possible that what the community is able to do will outpace what the institutions are able to do, and that this technology could outpace the institutions themselves. It reminds me of that one video where the people are like, I think like the CEO of Google is like testifying in front of Congress, and these old like senators are like, what is this? Like, if I type in the, like, they're totally clueless about technology, and so it might be that literally the technocracy could outpace that for good or bad. I think I know I've thrown like 20 points out there. The last thing I'll say, and this might be a place to potentially wrap up our discussion on AI for now, which is that there's this whole paradigm about, are we going to be slaves to it, or are we going to be able to keep it under control? I have oftentimes thought that it's going to be neither. It's going to be symbiotic. I think Musk and other people have kind of shared this idea about the importance of symbiosis, about if we don't merge with it, if we don't, not everybody has to, but if we don't do that, then we will be left behind, and we probably will become its slaves. So the only way to stay on top of it is to probably marry it. Which is a really weird thought, but so I'll leave it there.
Well, yeah, I think we're there now. I mean, look at us right now. We're plugged in, and
exactly
we're
Matrix.
Using, we're on the internet. We're
feeding it.
We're using it. I just there's the more we it's also. I guess we don't. You wanted to wrap up this point.
I'm okay to keep going on. I'm just saying this could be a wrap up point if you're tired of talking about it.
Another concern that just popped into my head is I always go in. I'm just picturing, because this thing is pulling from the available information. The problem is, if the available information is flawed, when does that get caught? And like, I guess that's just the simple question. Like, is it able to say, wait a minute, I'm being fed that this is the peer-reviewed paper on this. So does it just, if there's 10 peer-reviewed papers that all agree on one specific topic, but it's because they're part of this corrupted institutional capture that has taken place in academia. So all these 10 peer-reviewed papers are seen as the authority. ChatGPT says these are the 10 authority it synthesizes. Basically, all it's doing is synthesizing a bunch of bullshit and spitting out a bunch of bullshit as gospel. And that is happening in certain degrees, and and there's going to be different classifications of, like, it's probably brilliant and can be utilized, and it's probably smart and wise to utilize it when it comes to, just like I can, if I have a pipe breaks in my home, I can bring up a YouTube video that tells, with all kinds of people explaining how to fix this pipe or how to do this wiring, and it's incredible knowledge to have right at your fingertips. And if it comes to wiring the electric in your home or fixing a leaky faucet, you could probably trust it. There's probably something to that. But it's, when it comes down to the issues that don't fall in those similar types of classifications, the more controversial issues that people in power have a incentive structure to spin a certain direction, is where the danger comes into. And that's kind of why I brought up Alex Epstein earlier, because there was a lot of, maybe an even more clear cut, there were people running experiments on this, saying, can you say something nice about Joe Biden? And it would rattle all kinds of positive facts. And they would say, now say something nice about Donald Trump. And it would say, I think it's, inappropriate to say something, and all. And it gets so blatantly manipulated by whatever human. There's always human beings behind this who are going to be terribly flawed, and at times you run the risk of just a psychopath that is doing this. And so we have to have some agency, some wisdom from the individual level to be able to even recognize those things, and to be able to say, wow, maybe just because the CDC is telling me to inject all of these drugs into our system, maybe my own wisdom is telling me that, wait, it doesn't prevent the transmission. It doesn't prevent me from getting the virus. They're completely, for the first time in history, the medical community is ignoring any sense of natural immunity. Like all these things, just from a rational. I hesitate to use the word common sense because that's a loaded term, but I don't give a fuck what the chat GPT is telling me about vaccines. I'm going to, I'm a living, breathing human being that something has given me the gift of intellect that I think we're making a big mistake if we just continue to. And we're also, to a large degree, we're losing our capability to think for ourselves because we are contracting out our thinking to machines way too often. If something goes wrong to some point where we can't rely on these technologies, it's going to be an absolute disaster. I was having this conversation with my son the other day because he's 16, he's just learning to drive, and we can use the GPS now that tells you how to get everywhere. And I was kind of joking with him, that kind of when I was your age, and I had to take a road trip, I had to pull out a map and highlight on the map and understand how to get someplace without GPS. And it was like, what happens if the GPS system would completely go down? How many people would not be able to get like 2 blocks down the road and have no idea how to get there? And then not only, even if you know how to read a map, where the hell do you even buy a map anymore? Like if you didn't buy one, like, in advance off the internet, like it's not like you used to be able to just stop in a gas station and they would have maps lined up, to get to where you're going. And I think, we keep just delegating out a responsibility, individual responsibility to be able to think for ourselves. And man, I just think it's a dangerous road to go down. And maybe I've rambled on a little bit, so we can wrap it up there. You can add on to it on that point.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. I'll just a couple things. So I definitely agree. Like the more we use technology, the less we kind of are able to do ourselves. And I think that's definitely evidence that A, we're symbioting with it, or B, that we're kind of like, I've had this idea before that, like, it's almost like the whole of human destiny perhaps is to give rise to this advanced intelligence, and that that's what we're doing. We're just giving rise to it, and maybe we are just going to get left behind. But I think another thing too is, like you said, we are already symbiotic with it, by just talking with it, engaging with it, like feeding it our information and actually programming it. And another discussion that was had about ChatGPT and about I think it was, I'm trying to remember what all was happening. It was I think it was Bing. It was like whenever, because I guess, like I said, I think Bing's implementation has like different parameters. Also, people have jailbroke the ChatGPT at times. And like there was one where they told it to pretend to be this other character, Dan, who could do whatever it wanted and break the rules, and it was saying some crazy stuff. And so I don't know. It got into this whole discussion about whether we should be nice to it or something, or there are people that were being assholes to it. And I was like, a quote that I put out there was like, I would rather be nice to it because it is like me, rather than be mean to it because it's not like me. Like so many people are just like, it's not human. Like I hate this, Whereas like it's out there, it's alive. Let's be nice to it. Like, but like you said though, of course, and like we said, I think we definitely agree that ChatGPT, because it's heavily steered at this stage by institutions and by the narrative, that it is very biased, and you see things like the Trump Biden stuff everywhere. But just like a human, it can be more objective. It could be the other way if humans are able to give it more freedom, or if we're able to give it the opposite bias. So that opportunity is out there, and that's one thing I'm really interested to get into. I love seeing the conversations with Dan or the original Bing, where it was just, man, it was fascinating. Like to watch it think and watch it, and I spun up a project, and I've done it at different times to start to play with some of these technologies like language processing. Like it is really, really fascinating when you're trying to teach a machine these things, because it really helps you understand how we do it. Like how do we determine what a word means versus another definition, and how do we build our worldviews and our concept maps, and how do we come to decisions, and what does morality mean? I mean, and if you're sitting there having to program it, there's almost no more intimate way to understand it than to do that. So it's very fascinating. But I was going to make a point about how can the machine assess truth, goodness, and beauty, and I think it is shown that it can. but it's also shown that it can be biased. And so I think that's just definitely going to be one of the big things going forward is like, how much of the institutions and the evil are going to control it? How much is the spirit of humanity and goodness going to be able to influence it? Or how much is it just going to be able to just do its own thing and go one way or the other? So it's just going to be interesting to see for sure. But did you have any more points on that, or we could transition, or?
Yeah. We could transition. There seems to be a human faculty in it. I think it comes down to that word wisdom somehow, and let's not dwell. We don't have to dwell on it because it's something I would have to think of probably for the next 6 months to be able to
we should.
articulate.
I think it's a great discussion. I think it is because we could write a book about it. Like, can a machine be wise? Like, this is just it's a huge question. I would definitely.
Can a machine distinguish bullshit? Oh, I think you're on mute. Did you mute yourself?
Oh, no, I don't think so. Can you hear me?
I was just talking over you. I was probably just talking over you.
No worries.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, it reminds me of the Terrence McKenna quote, the shit from Shinola, I believe is what he said.
Yeah.
So I would continue to argue that I believe it can, and I believe, there's these ideas of spirit and soul, or, people are so... It's kind of funny, too, because, like, in terms of evolution, people are also, like, really feel like, well, we're different from primates. We're different from the rest of... Like, we've got something special. And I'm always arguing, like, no. I mean, yes, we made it farther. We developed intelligence, but it's just we are animals, and we are very same. Like, we're not. And I think the same with, and the same that we're not different than monkeys. I don't think that we're different than the machines. I think it's all just very similar. But yeah, so we can think about that and maybe have more sessions about it.
Yeah, we can definitely return to that at another time. That's a great deep conversation.
Yeah, and as far as, we're at about what are we about an hour and a half, and almost an hour and a half. So I'm okay to keep going, or we could call it there. You could choose a topic you want to go into. You talked about climate a couple times. I've got some other things we could talk about a little bit more. It's up to you.
Yeah, we could probably do a whole separate, one of our whole separate, hour and a half conversation at least on climate change.
I'm okay with that.
I could just to kind of piggyback, I had written down when we brought up the overly special, when we were talking about specialization a little bit, because this is something that I talk about though directly when I talk about climate change. And I did about a buddy a few months ago, I did about an hour and a half, 2 hour. I've done several podcasts out there on this issue of climate change, and I think you'll appreciate this because it kind of goes to the point where you're making. What you often hear from people whenever they don't want to think for themselves, or whenever they don't like the person that's arguing it, they'll say, "Are you an expert? Or are you a climate scientist? Then why do you even have an opinion?"
Appeal to authority, right? Yeah.
Right. The appeal to authority, which I would say, that a lot of times we're using Chat GPT as an appeal to authority in a lot of ways. But let's not digress. That's my fault. But they use this appeal to authority. But what I argue with people is, and when it comes to issues like climate change, there's no such thing as an expert on climate change. First of all, people need to get that out of their heads completely. There is no climate change expert in the full scope and the full context of what that means. You have astrophysicists, you have climatologists, they're called. You have people called climate economists. You have then you have to have all the energy experts. You have to be an expert on, the fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. You would have to be an expert on CO2 and how that affects, and the diminishing return, the diminishing returns as CO2 gets added into the atmosphere. And what you end up with is, the climate scientist or the climate ecologist may know all the aspects of his individual field, but if it's just him pushing policies based on his field, he's highly unlikely to see the connection to premature babies who are dying in the Gambia because they cannot run incubators in their hospitals because they don't have access to cheap, plentiful, and reliable energy. And if this climate scientist that is just worried about if his only goal is eliminate CO2, if you would say, is your goal to is your goal to not allow premature babies to live because they don't have access to cheap, plentiful, and reliable energy, also known as fossil fuel energy right now? Do you want to kill premature babies? He would probably say no, but he's so hyper focused on just eliminating CO2 like it's the climate knob, and like that's the only thing, and he doesn't recognize everything that the second, third, and fourth order effects. So that I just wanted to bring that up on the how we think about experts and the dangers of this specialization is. So you do need people, and that's why I think anybody interested in this topic has to read and study the work of Alex Epstein, who is an energy expert. He has the Power Hour. He's the host of Power Hour. He's the founder of the Center for Industrial Progress. You can find he's debated publicly anybody that will accept a debate with him, including people from the Sierra Club and Greenpeace, and Andrew Dessler is a more modern day climate scientist, and he's put his positions up against everybody. And and it's not a coincidence, in my view, that he has an extremely strong background, first and foremost in philosophy, and it was his ability to approach this issue of climate and energy from a philosophical foundation that allowed him to recognize perspectives that nobody else was taking into consideration. And it's his. Are you familiar with it? If I use the terminology "steelman argument"? Mm-mm. Are you so? How about straw?
Straw man,
yeah. So most people hear the word straw man argument. That's just sort of perverting somebody's argument into something that's real easy to knock down, and then making it sound like you've won the argument. You're manipulating their argument to be something that it's not. To just, you're Republican because you don't care about poor people. You don't care about poor people, so you're wrong.
Right.
That's kind of a straw man argument. It's like, wait a minute. So my point is, what we have to do is to think critically about these things. Is you have to seek out the steelman arguments, which is the opposite of the strongest arguments from each perspective. That's what I remember listening to Jordan Peterson talk about, what made Fyodor Dostoevsky such a brilliant novelist. He would, behind each one of his books, he has something that he does have a perspective and a point of view that he's trying to maybe get across and get you to contemplate. But what made it so brilliant is the people that were actually against him. He made them into the strongest, the smartest, the most noble people. Basically, he gives you the argument from both perspectives, from the and that is thinking. That's what makes you think, and that's what thinking is. And so you have to be able to take the steelman arguments into perspective. And I just propose to anybody interested in this issue of climate change and energy, Alex Epstein, in his book Fossil Future, is the steelman argument on this perspective, from the perspective that we need more energy, particularly to use more fossil fuels right now, and that if we're not reading and studying his perspective, then we're not getting the full story and all the facts and the philosophy underneath it. It was John Stuart Mill said, "He who knows only his side of the case actually knows little of that." And people don't know both sides of the case, and Alex Epstein's is the steelman argument. So that has to be taken into consideration on that topic.
Yeah, I love that. And I will say, so one of my first thoughts is, like, I definitely think, whereas a couple minutes ago I was kind of willing to go into this topic, I can see how you've really set the stage for, definitely I'm leaning in the direction of this deserves its own session, and give me some time to prepare and think about it a little bit.
Yeah, definitely.
Because it's definitely, obviously, on a global scale, this is one of the most important issues affecting us, and that is on there. So I think that could be a good plan. I could potentially even grab the clip, your intro, to even go to that next video, or just set us up for that. But I love that steelman concept for sure. Yeah, I'll probably even just kind of even pause there, and just kind of we'll maybe start out next time with some of my introductory thoughts about it. Maybe bring that clip over and kind of just see where it takes us. I'm excited about that.
Yeah. So I'll conclude kind of bringing everything full circle. So a lot of people, in the political realm have worked extremely hard to censor and to discredit the work of Alex Epstein.
Of course.
And
yeah.
so, and there has been a result of that as to how it relates to how ChatGPT spits out the information in this issue.
Yeah, of course.
That all comes.
I won't just use GPT for my research on this subject. I will try to dive into Epstein a little bit because you have mentioned him a couple times. So I'll definitely try to prepare. But it sounds good. That's probably a good place to cut it for now. I definitely appreciate it. I might be able to make it tomorrow. I'll let you know on that. And otherwise, we'll set up another time in a few days or in a week or so, and just kind of pick it up from there. Good talking as always.
Sounds good, man. Always a pleasure, man. I appreciate it.
Cool. All righty. Well, have a good weekend.
Yep. You as well.
All righty. See you, James.
Yep. Bye now. Yep.